Hello, friends. It is another Between Two Sundays, the show where this bloke and this bloke get together and chinwag over some stuff. And there's just some people out there in the world who happen to listen to it. And we're as surprised as you are, possibly. Hi, Mark.
Good. That was a great intro.
You like that
People
one?
will people will be thinking it is so clear what I'm listening to now.
It's like it's like that reading from last week, the Romans one. Um, Between Two Sundays, of course, is the show where we talk about the readings from the Revised Common Lectionary. We first of all have a quick chat, and a pretty quick one it is, about the readings that we've come out of and how we've taken them into the week that we're in now. And then we start to look towards the readings that are coming for this coming Sunday. This coming Sunday is the seventh Sunday after Pentecost, but first of all, we're just going to talk about the ones that have come out of the sixth Sunday after Pentecost. We had Genesis 24, we had Psalm 45 or Song of Solomon 2. We had Romans 7 and Matthew 11. Mate, what have you had stick to your ribs, as my mum would talk about porridge? Not that this is porridge necessarily, but anyway, what have you carried with you in the week?
Yeah, I found myself sitting with the Romans 7 reading, and um, this description of the law of God as being in my innermost self, and the law of God being the law of the mind, or my mind. Like I said last week, loved this idea. It got me thinking, this idea that there is an internal core in all of us that is a guide for us from the very heart of God. So really appreciated that. I found myself sitting with the Genesis reading as well. This is very greedy of me to take two, isn't it? But sitting with the Genesis reading, seeing this servant re-articulating this story of what has happened. And it seems to me that there's this coming together of his prayers in this, but also of the circumstances that have surrounded this coming together of this potential coming together at this stage of Rebecca and Isaac. Just sitting with this coming together of the inner and outer worlds. How much is this paralleled in this Romans reading? How different these two readings are as well. But to what degree is Paul arguing for a following of the Spirit that is a coming together of the inner and outer worlds, the world God has created, and the internal truth that God has put in every heart? I almost want to give it the language incarnation here, the coming together of what we have traditionally thought of opposites. This, the flesh, the worldly, and the very Spirit of God. What if we are, we go through the world and things come together when we look for the reality in both of these spheres that we so tend to pull apart? What if that's the essence of following after Jesus, is this essence of incarnation, that we move both through the world that God loves, that God created, but also there's this internal space that is calling us in the same direction. Stunned by the inner and outer coming together in that Genesis reading, and then Paul's appeal to that inner reality that he seems to say is God's word on the inside of everyone.
Yeah, that's good. Interestingly, the thing that stuck for me was a bit of the gospel that we didn't talk about. So in verse 25, we talk about verse 19. I touched on that one. Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they say, look, a glutton, a drunkard, friend of tax collector and sinners. And at that time, verse 25 says, Jesus said, I thank you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, because you have hidden these things from the wise and the intelligent and have revealed them to infants. Yes, Father, for such was your gracious will. This really stuck to me because as somebody who has worked with young people for 30 odd years, little kids get it. Probably the most recent example was a video that's been flying around. I think I've seen it before a couple of years ago, but it's a British video, and they just put two kids together who knew each other. Obviously, the kids aren't strangers. And in many ways, they were even clothed similarly, and they had differences that to an adult are pretty dang obvious. In one, it was a black kid and a white kid, and another one, it was an Asian kid and one was a boy, one was a girl. One was a girl in a wheelchair and a girl who wasn't in a wheelchair. And they said to the kids, what makes you different? And everything that I just referred to were the things that weren't said. They talked about things like, Lucy likes tomatoes, but I don't like tomatoes well, I used to like, I don't like them as much as Lucy does. Another one said, and two boys sitting there, one's black, one's white. What makes you different? They're looking at the camera going, trying to work something out. It's just beautiful because
Wonderful.
it shows that kids get it.
Yeah.
What makes us different? The kids are going, the foods we like. And they're not saying what we as adults go, come on, it's dang obvious. Maybe it's not dang obvious to us anymore because we've allowed ourselves to be clouded. And while we'll touch on this again this week, you touched on it last week in the Romans reading, talking about this idea of flesh as ego. Maybe it's because our egos have got in the way, and we have this thing that we grow into where we need to pit ourselves against other people in order to find some sort of place in our world, or at least we think we do. Maybe this is why Jesus was willing to say, kids get it. The wise and intelligent, or the so-called wise and intelligent, won't get it. But you have the mind of a child, the mind of an infant, you'll understand. That was incredibly powerful, particularly when we're talking about how easy but difficult it is to carry that easy burden.
Yeah.
So forth.
I love that. That's that action of being revealed to the infants and not to the intelligent is credited to God, the one who created everything, who knows everything, who is behind everything that is. This one is childlike. I think that's fantastic.
Yeah.
And a great reason to hang around kids.
Absolutely. I agree.
With the expectation not of teaching, but of learning.
Learning. Yes, indeed. This week is the 7th Sunday after Pentecost, and the readings for this week, where are we? Genesis 25, verses 19 to 34, Psalm 119, verses 105 to 112, Isaiah 55, verses 10 to 13, and Psalm 65, verses... Oh, sorry.
Hang on, I think we're skipping.
Back it up. Genesis 25, verses 19 to 34, Psalm 119, verses 105 to 112, Romans 8, verses 1 to 11, and Matthew 13, verses 1 through 23. If you want to skip over the 9 verses between 9 and 18, you can. You will find the proper links to those at lectionary.library.vanderbilt.edu. There are options to the readings for the Hebrew scriptures and the Psalm. That's why I mentioned Isaiah 55 and Psalm 65. They're the alternates. We won't be looking at those this week. We'll be looking at Genesis 25 and Psalm 119. Genesis 25. What do you got, buddy?
I think I touched on this last week. The idea that we have this very long story telling us of the coming together of Isaac and Rebekah. How God sits behind this, how the circumstances of life sit behind this, the circumstances of their coming together, really a miracle story. And yet, straight away, we find ourselves in a story where everything is not perfect. So you can imagine disappointment for both of them when there's 20 years with no kids in this marriage, perhaps even the embarrassment of that. Then Rebecca finally gets pregnant. Again, this is told as a miracle story. She is barren and now she is pregnant. Number of women in this situation in the book of Genesis. So it's almost a recurring theme that these pregnancies are God initiated. And yet this is far from an easy pregnancy, and it's far from an easy relationship with these two boys as they come into the world and become men. Jacob and Esau are two very, very different people. They operate in different spaces. They relate more closely to one to Isaac, one to Rebecca. So we almost get the sense here that that's not just kind of the way it is, and it is, but probably is the way it is. Most of us probably have a parent we relate to a little bit more closely. Yeah. Yet this is quite divisive and problematic in this family. So here we have God so clearly working in all of these relationships, and yet everything not going smoothly. Anything but. Yet we have this inquiry that Rebecca makes. What is going on in me? And this, I guess at the time, it felt just like a riddle. Two nations are in your womb. Two people born of you shall be divided. One shall be stronger than the other. The elder shall serve the younger. It almost sounds like something straight out of The Hobbit, doesn't it? This parable, this riddle that you've got to kind of work out. And I imagine Rebecca kind of sitting with this. And here is what is written as a foreknowledge of the division that this God-initiated relationship has produced. So you end up sitting in this incredible tension. What is this? Where are we going to see this line handed down? Jacob doesn't even seem to be very honest in this story as he takes the birthright, and it's only the first of another story where he takes what is rightfully Esau's. Yet in all of this mess, we have this claim that God is working in it. In all of this dishonesty, in all of this confusion, in all of this clashing of people, we have this almost this calm prophecy that's put over this scene of chaos that just says, I know what I'm doing. And this call, I think, for us to look at a passage like this, to look at a story like this and say, oh my goodness, these people are almost as messed up as I am, if not maybe even more. But God finds a way. God gets God's ways. The things that really matter get done in this story. And there's something very beautiful and hopeful about the idea that, gee, when I'm like Jacob and I mess up, try to get things done my way instead of God's way, maybe God's still working. So I wanted to sort of hold this story next to the idealism of the story we've just read last week about this coming together and everything will be happily ever after. Well, actually, this is a much more real, grounded story than this happily ever after bit. And yet, clearly, one of the messages here is that God is at work within it.
Yeah, I mean, look, I would go as far as to say this is actually a story of two great big egos that are smashing against each other, and both of them are just as disgusting as the other.
From the
Despite the
very
fact that
start.
there's exactly, despite the fact that
Yeah.
out there is this idea that, you know what I have actually had it preached that what Jacob here was the right thing to do. Bollocks! It's his ego getting in the way of something that could be heaps worse, and you see it right from the start of the story after the birth has come. We're told that Esau's a skillful hunter, and Esau, because he was fond of game, Isaac loved him. And the very next verse, Jacob's cooking a stew. So already you got this competition happening, at least in the mind of Jacob, because Esau's just doing his thing. In fact, the way that Robert Alter reflects on Esau, coming from a lot of the tradition within the Hebrew rabbis, was that Esau was just a buffhead, and that maybe this is why the lineage of God was the family, the nation that God was going to raise up was going to come through Isaac, evidently, because sorry, Jacob, evidently, because Esau was just too buffy to do it. And that maybe that some of that is in the writers of the story, and this wouldn't have been written down until much later, and that there's a little bit of that in there, which wouldn't surprise me if it were. So here you've got, Jacob cooking a stew because it's the only thing that with lentils. So it's veggie stew. I know as a vegan, it's not too bad, but compared to his dad who loves meat, this is going to be a bit of a meager offering and whatever. But Jacob's cooking the stew, and Esau comes in from the field and he's absolutely spent. And in fact, there's one Hebrew tradition that suggests that he doesn't just come home and he's spent. He actually comes home with a big chunk of meat hanging out of his mouth, raw meat. He is like, this is, alone Patagonia, Mongolia even. That was a pretty pre-war series where this is where you've got to get to, to try and find your way through. And he's just absolutely smashed hungry, and he sees, Jacob cooking this stew up, trying to compete, and straight away Esau, who's speaking from as much of an ego trip as Jacob is, can only think of one thing right there and then, and that is fill my belly. Get in my belly. I want this. What do you give me for it? My birthright. Oh, what do you want? I want your birthright. And in fact, it's interesting. In verse 31, in the version that we've got, the English translation we've got here, it says, Jacob said, sell me your birthright, or first sell me your birthright. Interestingly, in the Hebrew, it's not in that order. In the Hebrew, it is sell now your birthright to me. Jacob is very carefully holding the me back till the very, very end. So basically, you've got this creature, Esau, who is the holder of the birthright, but a suggestion that coming out of Jacob's own mouth, that the birthright rightly belongs to me. Now, whether his mother has told him the story of the prophecy she heard or whatever, I don't know. Like you said, maybe he's trying to wangle things to work in his favor. In either case, there's a lot of ego going on here from both sides. So much so that Esau was willing to throw in the birthright because his ego is basically like, I don't need that crap. I just need food in my belly. And he's willing to take the short-term gain for the long-term pain, I suppose, if you want to put it that way. And so verse 34, when Jacob gave Esau bread and the lentil stew, he ate and drank and rose and went on his way. He literally ate and drank and rose and left. That's how rapid fire it was. It was sit, guzzle, and go. And it was over. And so basically in this story, you've got these two egos that have absolutely gone out against each other. And Esau wanted stew. Jacob saw his opportunity and wanted a birthright. Jacob thinks he's got it from that. but frankly, if you go like further on in the story, you get to that moment when Isaac goes to pray for them, and Jacob's still got to disguise himself. It's not as if it's a given that Esau walks in and goes, "Oh yeah, the stew. You go into Dad. I'll explain it to Dad." No, 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 no. Jacob's still got to dress up, and his mother puts hairy goat skins on him and all sorts of stuff to make it seem like it's him. So there's still a lot of deception going on later on. So this is not a fait accompli. This is not a given that it's going to happen now. But right here in this story, two big egos going against each other, which is interesting because when we get to the psalm, we see the complete opposite.
Yes.
In the psalm, we see someone who's willing to submit, who's willing to let go, who, to talk about the ego in the way that Patrick Oliver, and I've spoken about Patrick a bit on this show and a lot in my other shows, and on the Monkey Docs podcast, if you haven't listened to, I think it's episode 4, episode 6, where I interview Patrick Oliver about this whole thing on the me and the I and ego and all that sort of stuff, and the difference between hope and expectation. But the me and the I in particular, this is beautiful contrast here. In the Genesis story, you've got two me's who are going at it. In Psalm 119, you've got the voice of an I, somebody who's willing to say, I need to know who I am within the context of sitting in the hands of God. And so your words are lamp to my feet. Your words are guide to my path. If only Jacob had listened to the teaching of what this God was saying, that would not have happened. And so right here, even in severe affliction, verse 107, give me life. And I'm going to walk the way of life. So the psalm, I think, and this will be a short and sweet on the psalm for me this week, but the psalm, I just think, stands in distinct contrast to both of the ego trips between that Jacob and Esau are. You've got this contrasting voice of the psalmist who's saying, I will incline my heart to perform your statutes forever to the end. And the question that I get left with as I read these two things, which, as we know, in the context of the readings, one throws voice to the other, is to hold these two stark paradoxes in hand and go, which one am I going to live like? Am I going to live like a Jacob and an Esau and keep throwing my ego out there because that's just the way it's going to happen? I'm going to manipulate it and make it work. Am I going to submit to the path that is going to be with me and take me on a way of joy and peace and calm right to the very end, not the tumultuous stuff we get out of the Jacob and Esau story?
I wonder if it's worth just saying that the commonality between the Psalm and the Genesis story is that the word of the Lord comes. So there's this prophecy at the beginning of this. And, while Jacob seems to take it into his own hands to bring about the outcome of this prophecy, in the Psalm, you're absolutely right. There's this sense of just sitting, resting, trusting. Very, very different. Even though, God works with it, a very, very different approach to the word of God.
God works with it, but what does it do for the human beings involved?
Absolutely. Terribly destructive for this family. To the point that, and we'll get to this later, I'm pretty sure, Abraham is eventually old and blind. So he has lived a long time. And Jacob comes with his goat skin covered arms. And Isaac does not trust the voice in front of him. So this will go on for a lifetime. It's not healed. It's never fixed. Isaac dies soon after that. Isaac and Rebecca, they go to the grave with this grudge. This, Rebecca becoming as much the deceiver as Jacob has. Don't you just wish they'd sat with this riddle from God and said, God, you bring about whatever you are doing. And maybe so much of this could have been avoided. We'll never know. In some ways, this is the telling of a story, not the presenting of an alternate.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it really does make you wonder, doesn't it?
Well, even to the point where,
what would have happened if they'd sat humbly with this word of God?
and I think you've raised a really good point there. The word comes to Isaac and Rebecca, but you've got to wonder if Isaac was, Esau was Isaac's favorite and Jacob was Rebecca's favorite. Did Isaac keep this from Esau, but Rebecca tell Jacob because she was puffing him up for, in the future now, it's okay, you're going to be the one, it's all right. Wondering how it was going to happen. And then, of course, as Isaac gets older and eats lentil stew and lives in tents, they're both good things.
Yeah, of course.
Being vegan and hanging out in tents, that's my vibe. But anyway, can't go there. Romans 8, then. Let's move into the text in the Christian Testament. This is, of course, a very, very famous piece of work, which I think finds its truer sense in what we've been saying for the last couple of weeks now and what I just raised before, in that whole difference between thinking about flesh not as how we would talk about it in English as being carnality and having to do with humanness, but rather to do with ego, the me versus the I. And in fact, I would encourage people to read this passage and understanding that, to cover it again, the me is the ego self, the one who puffs themselves up, has these masks that they wear, doesn't know knows who they truly are, but doesn't present that in public or whatever else. The I is the one that's simply happy to rest in the knowledge of knowing who you are, and who you are happens to be all you have to be, and it's enough because God sees you as enough. You don't have to be anything more than who you are, and you'll probably be far happier if you just be you. If you read this passage, and everywhere it says flesh, you talk about ego or you talk about the me. So in verse 3 you have, for God has done what the law, weakened by the me or the ego, could not do, by sending his own son in the likeness of sinful flesh or ego, and to deal with sin, he condemned sin within that context of the ego self, but he did it from a position, as he goes on to say, according to the Spirit. So that you have this whole ideal that comes through this. This is not about, you've got this, actually it appeals to last week's passage. A lot of people read this and talk about, you've got people of the flesh and people of the Spirit, and never the twain shall meet. And until you are a person of the flesh, who becomes a person of the Spirit, it's all done and dusted. What I think Paul's saying here, which rolls on well from the reading we had last week, where, as you pointed out, Paul's actually talking about this stuff going on within himself, using this term flesh. If we're talking about this battle that's not going on between those people of the flesh and those people of the Spirit, and you need to move from there to there, but this thing that goes on between us, where the image of God is present within there already, the Spirit is there, but we've got this ego mind that keeps fighting against that. That's where the battle is. It's not there, it's in here. And it is solved by not living within the context of the ego, but submitting to that still small voice of the image of God that's within us, that beautiful spirit of peace and love and truth and beauty, as opposed to the thing that says, I want those things, peace, love, truth, and beauty, but I'm going to get them by fighting that guy and submitting him, and I'm going to get it by doing this thing, but I'm going to do it ugly, and all the opposites of that stuff. We think we can get, and if you look at history, it's true. How many people to say we have to go to war in order to get peace? Really? Come on now. But this fight goes on within us, and I think if we understand Romans 8 as coming from that place, as opposed to that whole, you got to flip from here to there, I think we actually get a far better idea of what it is that Paul's talking about, not just in this part, but right the way through this letter to the Roman church.
Yeah. I think this is a really, really helpful. That's a really helpful reflection. Um, what struck me here was the language of walk, live, set the mind. This language of I think it's essentially, are you going to feed the ego or are you going to feed the spirit?
Yes.
That's what's being said here. Which wolf are you going to feed, to tap into the old parable of the good wolf and the bad? Which one's going to win? It's going to be the one you feed.
Yeah.
And there's something here that's very action orientated. It's not just this is not Paul writing just so everyone will understand and be able to explain what's going on. This is much more Paul writing so that we will know which reality of us to feed. And he's saying that you know, there is an incredibly hopeful assumption here that we can walk in the Spirit. We can have this mind of Christ within us. There's just something in this that's very practical to me. And I get worried, especially when it comes to Romans, that people will often use Romans as a way of explaining the gospel. But actually, it's so much more than that. There's a real call to practicality here.
Yes.
I can't help reading this and saying and feeling it as a call to prayer rather than a call to figuring it out. Using it as hearing it as a call to go about my daily work with an open mind to the Spirit of God, going about my relationships with my family with an open mind to the Spirit of God, and knowing that that's the deepest part of me, as we said last week. That's the deepest part of who we are. It's not an external thing that we need to manufacture or chase. Actually, it's this is the core of who we are as people made in the very image of God.
Which I think again speaks so strongly to the gospel passage from Mark 13. Besides the fact that Jesus gets in a boat and tells a story about farming, could have pulled a fish story out, but no.
He'll get there. He'll get to the fish stories.
Paradox. I love it. No, it might have been going. He's on a boat going, okay, we're going to plant seed. Well, what now? Okay. But I think there's
all the people were on the land.
True. Yeah, I'm out here, so you need to do this. So there's just a couple of really interesting things that I find about this passage, which we've all read so often and heard interpreted in a bazillion different ways. But the thing that really hit home for me, going back to what we've been discussing around this whole flesh and ego thing and where Paul's talking about, is this is not talking about 4 different types of people, which is how some people would interpret it. This is actually talking about the 4 different ways that my heart receives seed. And depending on how I'm sitting at the time, some of this stuff's going to get in the way, or it'll be soft enough to receive the seed. And so this is not just a reflection about that guy, this guy, that guy, this guy. This is actually a reflection on who I am. And I can be all of these things at any different time. I'd be kidding myself if I told you that I was soft, good soil all the time. What a joke. There are times when I'm rocky and hard. There are times when I've allowed the thorns and the weeds to come in and choke things out. There are times when I've left it out there and the birds have just come and taken it away because I've sat around and procrastinated or ignored it or whatever. So this is all about me. And it's interesting, again, talking about this whole ego/flesh thing. These reactions sort of relate back to that. The reaction of the birds eating up the soil, the rocky path, and the thorns and the weeds. all those are when we allow ourselves to ignore, to try and pursue our own thing, go our own way, forget about what's there, ignore what's there. The good soil happens when we literally turn ourselves to a point that we're willing to receive it. And I'll say this, we live in a place here in Western Queensland, just on the Darling Downs, just outside of Toowoomba. And basically from where I live, if you drive west, you only have to go about 10 minutes. You get just past, 10 Ks up the track, just get past there and suddenly that you realize, first of all, I can't see any mountains anymore in the distance. It's just flat. There's nothing there at all. But it is good farming land, which is why all the farms and the crops and the farmers came out this way to plant their farms. And what's interesting about this land out here is it's good, black, rich, worm-riddled soil, that really nice clay stuff, which can be tricky sometimes because it's kind of sticky and stuff, particularly when it gets wet. But when it gets dry, it cracks open. And what's interesting about that is that you can still put seed down, but cracked land can still receive seed and allow the seed to go down. And so it's remembering that it's not a case of, oh, I'm dry, therefore I can't receive good seed. No, you still can. And I would argue that in certain places, there are going to be weeds where if you throw down seed, if the soil can just receive some of it, what's planted can actually choke the weeds out. And I would also argue that there are places where you can throw seed down where it's on enough of an undergrowth that the birds won't even notice it. And so in each of these situations, there's still a way for you to allow the seed to enter in. The problem isn't so much the ground. The problem is why the ground is the way that it is, I think. And so while, yes, the best soil to receive is that good soil, I've got good soil here, but it's dry right now. But the seed's still going to drop through. Why? Because the soil's good. And so it's not so much the conditions around the soil, it's whether the soil is good. This is what really got drummed home for me.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
Don't let the conditions dictate the fact that your soil is good. Now, you need to still, like when it's dry, it's good to get out there and put some moisture on the soil. When the birds are out there, stick a scarecrow up. When the weeds are coming up, get out there and pull the weeds up. I'm not saying leave it the way it is, but what I'm saying is that I think we can get to a point where, like, oh, all the cares and concerns of the world, I can't receive anything good until I get rid of them all. No, you just have to be good soil. And you can still receive some of it. In fact, Jesus tells a parable later about how the weeds and the wheat grow up in the same place. So don't be telling me that you can't have weeds and you still can't have seed get down. So this is a parable about being good soil. Don't get distracted by the other bits. I don't think Jesus is saying, if you're dry, you can forget it. What he's saying is if you're dry, you could, unless you're willing to be good soil, because that's the soil that will receive the seed.
Yeah. I want to argue that in a very simple, repetitive way, Jesus is telling us here how to be good soil.
Yeah.
And he's doing it over and over again from the very beginning to the very end. And I'll just read out the stuff I've underlined here and see
I'm
if
only
you can
laughing because I'm
hear.
thinking, be good soil, sit in the sea.
See if you can hear the repetition, because I think the repetition here is what this is all about, and it's a very empowering repetition.
Okay.
So Jesus opens this parable by saying, listen. And he ends the parable by saying, let anyone with ears listen. The first parable Jesus has told begins and ends with a command or an invitation to listen. And then um, then you've got that middle bit, and then you've got an explanation to this parable. And here's what Jesus said: "Hear then the parable of the sower. When anyone hears the word," and then later, "This is the one who hears the word and immediately receives it." Later again, "This is the one who hears the word, but it yields nothing." And then, "This is the one who hears the word and understands it." Jesus' opening parable, I would argue, is all about inviting us to listen carefully, to chew over these stories and just allow them to do their work.
Yeah.
And yes, I entirely agree with you. There is something really important about saying, I find myself being all these soils, because as soon as you interpret this as, there's one group over here who's like this, and there's another group over here who's like this, and another group over here is, and then there's me who's the good soil, because as good Christians, we would read this parable and almost automatically put ourselves in that category. As soon as you do that, this is a disempowering parable.
Yes.
Jesus is talking and saying, for some, you can't even hear. For some, there's all these weeds of the world, and this will choke out what you do. But I'm just going to scatter and throw and throw and throw. And then for some of you, this is good, and this makes sense. As soon as you do that, you're in this category of, okay, so I'm not sure what the purpose of listening is in this parable, but what I know is that some people will be able to hear this and some people won't. And I'm just going to put myself in the final category of the one who can hear. That is a disempowering parable, because it tells us that everything's determined. It's all predetermined stuff. But if we centralize listening carefully, chewing over Jesus' parables, allowing them to do their work in us, I think we end up with a story that says, you have the capacity to listen well.
Yeah.
And there are times when there are barriers to this. But when I open my mouth and I tell these cryptic stories, I want you to listen from the very depths of your heart.
Yeah.
I can't help but relate this back to our Romans reading, where we've just been talking about walking, following, living in the Spirit.
Yeah.
Seeking that life and peace, recognizing the depths of what is already there. I don't think this is Jesus saying, oh, some will listen and some won't, and I don't care. I think Jesus is saying, I want everyone to listen. I want all of you to listen from the very depths of your being. And I know there'll be stuff that you don't get right now. That's okay. I'm going to tell this in such a creative way, it'll stick in your head, and you'll be able to chew over this 20 years' time, when you've got a deeper depth of understanding of this kingdom that I'm promoting. I think this is all about saying to these disciples, as they hear this first parable, this beautiful first parable, listen well, listen from the depths of your being. If there's stuff you don't get, keep on listening. If there's things that get in the way, keep on listening. This is why this language is repeated here over and over again. You can't memorize this parable and its explanation without noticing the repetition of the call to hear and listen well.
Absolutely.
But that makes no sense as soon as you use this as a parable that says, the devil has just snatched away what's been said for you, but for me, that hasn't happened. That's a disempowering parable. But the invitation to listen, the invitation that the Spirit, well, I think the deep expectation Jesus holds that the Spirit of God will use this parable in these lives of people who don't even hear the explanation of it. I think reflects a very deep belief that the Spirit of God will use this story in God's perfect timing. And there's this plea within that: be one who's open.
Yeah, and I think you've nailed it really, really well in that this is a story, a parable about how to listen,
Yes.
how to hear.
Yeah.
And I'm sitting here
really
listening.
Well.
I'm listening to listen to you talk. Then I'm thinking, how different would that story in Genesis have been if Esau and Jacob had sat down one day and Esau had said, "Listen, look, I see where this whole call of God's going on, granddad and on dad. And I'm looking at us and I'm going, you know how to dwell in tents. I'm a hunter. I'm not the guy for this job. Let's go see dad and say, look, the line should go your way because you get more of where this tribe seems to be going. And I'll go and launch out and do my own thing over here. I'll do something different." What if Jacob had just submitted to what was supposed to have been a prophecy and just prayed quietly, "Okay, God, you've got this under control. I'm just going to do my thing and I'm listening." What if they'd listened like that? What if Isaac and Rebecca, and particularly probably Rebecca, sorry, but what if they had just listened instead of trying to manipulate, possibly, we don't know, but, midrashically trying to manipulate things in the background to make this stuff happen. So the idea that you're calling on there, I think, is really, really helpful to understanding how that story in Genesis could have gone way differently instead of what came about. Came about. I think that's the first sneeze I've ever done on air, on a podcast.
Mate, it's a
How
day
good's
of
that?
firsts.
And if you caught that, you got it.
Very good.
There you go. Are we done?
I'm happy to be done there.
It ends with a
I
sneeze.
did want to point out that all that listening stuff, I think you said exactly the same thing when you said this is about how my heart receives the seed.
Yeah.
I think that's listening.
That's right. Yeah, we weren't in disagreement, I didn't think.
Yeah, no, I didn't think we were in disagreement. I just thought I thought you were saying exactly the same thing and being very faithful to this, even while I've wanted to point out the language that is used and repeated here. I think it's saying exactly what you saw.
Absolutely. Boom, boom. There you are, my friends. This has been the 7th Sunday after Pentecost on Between Two Sundays. Our readings were Genesis 25, verses 19 to 34, Psalm 119, verses 105 to 112, Romans 8, verses 1 to 11, and then Matthew 13, verses 1 to 23, with those 9 verses in the middle pulled out because they really don't relate to the parable. Well, they kind of do, and they're probably worth reflecting on, but we won't go there tonight. Make sure that you're letting us know.
If I was doing this reading on Sunday, I would put them in. I think they're integral.
You're a good man. Listen, yes, it is integral. I was kidding about it not being. It's just anyway.
No, I wasn't thinking you were. I just I do look at this and I'm a bit frustrated by it. I think Matthew's being shortchanged by pulling this out of the middle of it. Yeah. I understand the temptation. You want to pull the two, the parable and its explanation together, but
that's right.
I think the middle bit is part of it as well.
If you want to join us in the conversation, jump onto the email between2sundays@gmail.com. That's a number 2 between the between and the Sundays. Between2sundays@gmail.com. Go to Mark's website, barefootfollower.life. Go to mine, monkeydocs.podia.com, or hit up at monkeydocs at Instagram or Facebook and drop us messages, notes, worries, concerns, threats, ideas, whatever you've seen, heard. We're wanting to hear from you and see what it is that you're seeing with us. I think that's it. Mate, we're done.
Great job.
Awesome. Thank you for joining us, folks. We hope you'll join us again next week for another Between Two Sundays. So until then, bless you, peace be with you, and bye for now.
Bye.